Continuing with our exposition of the book of Romans, I would like today to try and exhaust verse 17 of chapter 1. In the last few episodes, we have been looking at verse 16 and partly verse 17. So for the purposes of context, I will read both 16 and 17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. In verse 16, which opens up the conversation for both verse 16 and 17, Paul is talking about the gospel. But interestingly, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. So, firstly, it's important to ask the question of how he links the word shame with the next phrase, verse 16b, which says it is the power of God. That if the gospel is the power of God, why should anyone be ashamed? Is there anybody who is ashamed of power, of something more powerful? In any case, even in our fallen beings, in our fallen nature, we are attracted to power, never ashamed of power. Why does Paul link shame with God's power? For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God to salvation. But verse 17 does begin to respond to the question that I have just posed. For he says, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. I want you to notice the word revealed, which is the word apocalypto. It is equivalent, of course, to when you go to the book of Revelation, you are talking about uncovering, revealing, removal of blindfolds or masks, as it were. And so Paul says that that power of God that is contained in the gospel is not so obvious. It has to be revealed. In the righteousness of God, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is uncovered. And so this revelation has a lot to do with our spiritual sight. That, as Jesus would say in John chapter 3, unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And so this is a problem of sight. The fact that men go blindly without, number one, understanding the gospel, and secondly, and by the same light, they do not understand the righteousness of God. And therefore, it is easy to be ashamed of a gospel that is not being understood, because you are seen as propagating a gospel that makes no sense. And so until men and women are uncovered or unveiled for them to see the beauty of the gospel, for them the gospel is foolishness. And Paul would say that over and over again in various other epistles. The book of 1 Corinthians, he would say it is foolishness to those who are perishing. And therefore, when they turn to us and they mock the gospel we preach, it's only because their eyes are veiled. They cannot see the gospel. They see the proclamation of the gospel as a fool's errand. The reality is in the opposite. They are eternal fools, those whose eyes are not open to the gospel. Because Paul says in verse 17, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. I want to look at that word righteousness, dikaiosune in the Greek. The word righteousness has everything to do with God's standards. And because here we are not talking about the righteousness of man, we are talking about the righteousness of God. This righteousness has to be the perfect righteousness. It is of God, and that would really mean that it comes from God. It's possessed by God. God is the originator. In the same way that we saw in Romans chapter 1 and verse 1 and 2, the fact that the gospel belongs to God. It is possessed by God. In the same way, the righteousness that we speak about in verse 17 is possessed by God. In the gospel, the righteousness that belongs to God is revealed from faith to faith. I would like you to consider the righteousness of God perhaps as a garment. And when you consider this garment, I want you to further see that it is God's garment. It belongs to God, and by that virtue, it must be holy. That garment must be perfect. That garment must be pure because it belongs to God. That garment of righteousness is God's. And so God has to take off his own garment of righteousness and place that garment on a corrupt human being, on those who have only filthy rags to show for. But here I want you to notice, because we are talking about an eternal God, the fact that this God is eternal, the fact that this God is mighty, the fact that this God is glorious, this God is self-existent. By giving out his righteousness, he does not by any means become less righteous, because in him is all that righteousness is contained. In other words, he gives out, but he never gives out to lose something, as Augustine of Hippo would tell us in the Confessions. And so God's gift to us does not, unlike us, when we give to others, we lose something. Never so with God. And so the righteousness of God, or the garments of God as it were, God removes them from himself. He is still left fully righteous, and yet covers us in his own garments, his own perfect garments of righteousness. I want you to notice again what I have said earlier, that this righteousness, the garments of God, are revealed, or the garment of God is revealed. Again, it has to be unveiling, because we are blind, because we don't seek after God, because we are corrupt, because our eyes can only see darkness. There is no light in us unless that light comes from God himself. That is how far we have fallen from the glory of God, as Paul will say later in Romans chapter 3. So the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. But I also want you to notice, he says here that that revelation happens by faith. That we don't physically see. This is not for everybody. This has to occur to those to whom revelation has happened to them. And therefore it's by faith. It's apprehended by faith. These garments of righteousness are seen and appropriated by faith. As it is written, those who are just shall live by faith. Those that God has justified shall live by faith. I want to retreat again back to that word righteousness and suggest to you that while we are talking about the righteousness that belongs to God, we also are talking now about the question of God's justice. The fact that God in his absolute perfection, if he has to apply his moral ruler across the earth, everyone falls short. 100% fall short of that standard that God would set forth or rule the world by. And because God is the just judge that Jesus would talk about in the book of Luke chapter 18, it follows that God's demand for us would be absolute perfection. That is why we have no chance before him unless he covers us in his own garments of righteousness. Unless we are clothed from on high with the righteousness of another. we have no chance of approval before God. And so God can only approve that which comes from him, because that which comes from him is that which is perfect. But then lastly, I want you to notice here, going back to that theme of the gospel, Paul says, the gospel reveals all this. It reveals the righteousness of God. Secondly, the gospel, through it, a revelation occurs. That without the gospel, there is no revelation of that righteousness. So revelation is the second theme. The third theme that he talks about in verse 17 is faith, believing, spiritual eyes that are open so that we are persuaded of this righteousness of God. And then lastly, as I said earlier, it is the question of justice. That if we have to confront this just judge, we must be perfect, otherwise we are condemned. And so it would follow that unless we are covered in this perfect righteousness, we have nothing of our own. We are debtors who can never repay our debts. We are fugitives who are only covered in filthy rags. And no matter how much we try, no matter what we do, no matter what we say, ultimately we fall short of God's perfect standard of justice. And so God has to be merciful, or we are condemned and doomed. And his mercy and grace is revealed. And so when we proclaim the gospel, we proclaim the mercy of God that he has shown to fallen fugitives, to fugitives who run away at any chance from him, fugitives who pursue anything else but God, as Paul would say in Romans chapter 3, verse 12. In that state of fallenness and corruption and sin, rebellion and arrogance against God, God's mercy comes down to this creature of clay. And we are told that we are covered in this righteousness that comes from God, perfect righteousness. And so, dear beloved, if I am a minister of the gospel and I am not proclaiming the revelation of the righteousness of God, if I am not proclaiming the justice and the holiness of God by which we must face and confront our eternity, if I am not proclaiming that gospel that reveals the righteousness of God, then I am not proclaiming the gospel. Any proclamation that does not contain Christ as God's righteousness, any gospel that does not seek to uncover or unveil the veil and the blindfold that men and women have so that they cannot see the holiness of God, they cannot see the righteousness of God, they cannot see the fact that they are doomed without a perfect righteousness that must come from God himself, then I am not proclaiming the gospel. If I am talking about good things that we must appropriate in this world, and I do not show men and women their eternal destiny, and the fact that that eternal destiny requires that they meet the perfect standards of God, if I do not proclaim such gospel, then I am to be pitied, because I too will be called into account. And every proclamation I make, I will give account of the kind of gospel I proclaim. I don't want blood in my hands. Neither do I pray that anybody would stand before God charged by propagating a gospel that is false, or a gospel that is not gospel at all. And so any minister of the gospel listening to my voice this moment, my call to you is to shun false gospel. Shun proclaiming what people want to hear. Proclaim the justice and the holiness of God, because by it men see their depravity and corruption. And when they see their depravity and corruption, when they see their uncovering, they run to the refuge that is the way, the truth, and the life. And there is only one refuge. There is only one place to hide. That is the righteousness of God himself, provided through Christ. Therefore, in the gospel, we find that righteousness. So we must never be ashamed of that truth. We proclaim it with boldness and with power.